Hey everybody, welcome back to Sacred Cow Barbecue. I'm so pleased that my Irish guest tonight is joining us at O'Dark 100 where he is. Mike Walsh and I both agree ethnic Europeans, wherever they are in the world, need to start showing the same ethnic pride and cohesion as do other races. Non-whites stick together, and of course the Jews are well known for sticking together like burrs. Mike says it's about time that ethnic whites put their race before country, politics, or any other ridiculous divisions that we've been saddled with. And since our focus is political prisoners this evening, it's fitting that Mr. Walsh joins us, as he was imprisoned in 1979 for 4 months on 4 charges of racial incitement. I'll have him talk about that in a minute. I won't give it away. And he was in prison. He was subjected to terrorist methods intended to intimidate, as I'm sure Angie Bundy can say has been going on with her husband and the rest of the men. But of all his accomplishments, he's perhaps best known to Americans as the author of an epic 4-volume set of books, Witness to History. Whites have been brainwashed into being colorblind. Mike Walsh, welcome to Sacred Cow Barbecue. I'm delighted you're here tonight.
Well, good evening, Patricia, and good evening, America, and wishing you well from Europe here, and, well, as you say, all Europeans together.
Yeah, you know, Mike, and I said that you're going to have some good news for us, that you see some good signs of resistance going on in Europe.
Absolutely. I think what needs to be remembered, both in the United States and Europe, is that the Jewish-owned media is controlling things, so they're controlling your news, so they are creating an atmosphere in which you think that Europeans are generally laid back or they're welcoming refugees. This is quite the opposite to the truth. They're not reporting the news, they are making the news, and in actual fact, the vast majority in Europe are fed up to the back teeth with the dictatorship of the European Union. It has 2 presidents, neither of them are elected, nobody knows their names, and the government basically is 22 commissioners, not one of which has been elected. So that's the stage we're in. This is what used to be the Soviet bloc. And the former Secretary of State of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, he said, why are you trying to create out of the European Union an exact copy of the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc rather? And this is exactly what is happening. But these awful powers, they were overthrown by people power, and we're getting very close to it now, Patricia.
Yes, well, I'm delighted to hear that, Mike, because we're at the same stage here in the U.S. It's Bolshevik America, and most people, like Alaska, they've been brainwashed into thinking that this is like Nazi Germany. It would be a paradise if it was like Nazi Germany. It is like Bolshevik Russia, and that's what your book, your 4 volumes, sets out to dispel that myth, doesn't it?
That's right. It just evaporates all of the lies that are being told, and it was quite the opposite. As a matter of fact, I'm working on the next book now, which is The Reich Renaissance, and basically it is in 4 sections, 1 book, 4 sections, and it will show the United States in the 1930s, when it was suffering so badly from the Great Depression. The 7 million of your American citizens died of starvation or starvation-related diseases. Very similar figures in proportion to Britain. Absolutely terrible in the Bolshevik-occupied Russia. But in Germany, this was one country that stood out like a beacon. And if there was one country in the 20th century that really, when people see the reality, they would wish to belong to, be a citizen of, it would be the Workers' Reich between 1933 and until war was declared upon it, well, let's say June 1940. So, yeah, they had 7 or 8 years of absolute paradise until the Allies got together, 3 empires against one country smaller than the size of Texas, and because of its success, brought it to ruin, did the same as to the Workers' Reich as they did to Libya, they tried to do to Syria, they did in Afghanistan and Iraq. They brought a beautiful, prosperous country to total ruin. So this is what they're trying to do again. We're seeing history repeating itself, and instead of Adolf Hitler being demonized, we're seeing Putin demonized, and we've got to stop it. The internet will stop it, and united Europeans will stop it.
Well, I appreciate your faith in that, Mike, because what we see, obviously, like you said, it's the Jewish controlled media that we're looking at, and they're not like last it was a week or so ago. They put out a sign that's been photoshopped, and I'm glad somebody. And I said no, nobody would. They had to pay someone to use this sign, but no, it was photoshopped of women saying we'd rather be raped by immigrants than defended by racists.
Yeah, this is right, and of course they used it. This is a rerun. This is what they did during the war and presumably before the war. And I do remember in apartheid, separation, racial separation, South Africa, the BBC and other Western media were constantly expelled from South Africa for telling lies. And a common ploy from the journalists, not just the BBC, the all, is they would throw a few coins into a street bin. And of course, kids, America, doesn't really matter, Germany, Britain, kids being kids, would scramble into the bins to recover the coins. And this was then broadcast to Britain, in which people were told that whilst the white people were living off the fat of the land, the poor little black kids were having to scrounge for their food in the street bins. And this was the lie that they told. They were constantly doing this sort of thing.
I think you said it well, Mike, when you said they're not reporting the news, they're creating the news.
Yeah, it's a lot of these banners they're either paid. They used to do the same to me when I used to lead the British movement marches through London, another great British form.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that for a minute, because I'm late to the party here on being racially aware, but you've been involved for a good long time and at a high level. Tell us what the British movement was about.
The British movement was about keeping Britain white, and of course it failed in that respect. The powers were far too great. On this occasion, Jack didn't win, Goliath has won, or rather, he has won so far. But I was attracted to the British movement when it was a member of the World Union of National Socialists, which was led by your own George Lincoln Rockwell in the mid-1960s. I was attracted to an advertisement that said, "Keep Britain white, back the British movement." I telephoned or I wrote. We didn't have an internet in those days, of course. The rest is history. About a couple of months later, I took over the British movement, and it became the most powerful right-wing party, if you like. I don't like to use that term, ethnic European party, since Germany in the 1930s. So it was immensely successful. I was the last British leader to speak from Trafalgar Square in London. I was the last one to speak from Brick Lane, which was the watering hole, if you like, of Oswald Mosley and the British Union of Fascists. And we were just breaking frontiers down, and we were doing absolutely well. We were uniformed. But as I said before, we were talking about the tricks of the press. And when we used to march in a very well-ordered, wonderfully dressed, uniformed column through London, what the media guys used to do is they used to pay hippie types, the really low-life, to join in at the end of the march. There was little we could do about it because the police would stop us anyway. Then they would take photographs of these freaks, these losers, and then, of course, on the television or in the newspapers the next day, people didn't see my smartly dressed, well-regimented column. They saw all the hippies and they were told this was the British movement. Well, of course, nobody wanted to join the British movement, did they? That was the whole idea. That's what they say. They're making the news. They're not reporting the news. They're making the news.
Every trick in the book.
They know it all. And the analogy that I have used before is picture in your mind a citadel, a fortress, a castle, call it what you will. But in there is the ruling elite. And the walls, the ramparts, the towers, the turrets, everything that protects the elite inside, it's the press and the police. And we are the peasants, and we're trying to get through those walls to get at the political elite and throw them out.
The press, the police, and the courts.
Absolutely. Well, when I say the police, I mean the judicial system, part of the judicial system.
Yeah.
And I haven't got an awful lot of respect. I'm sorry to say, I know that you Americans are a little bit different from us, and you do respect the uniforms. But anybody who wears the state uniform, I'm going to raise an eyebrow and just say, what's this guy on about?
Well, I'm sure there's some good men in there, but they're outnumbered. and they will stay in a very low rank if they don't, or get drummed out if they don't do the bidding of their handlers.
Yeah, they're just following orders, aren't they, Patricia?
Yeah, it's so funny because the sham, the absolute kangaroo court that was the Nuremberg trials. I mean, when they always like to quote that, saying that it's just crazy that they like to quote that and say, oh, they were just following orders, and they say that doesn't count, but that's what these men are doing, men
Yeah,
and
but of
women.
course, yeah, these trials, people in their innocence, we can't be expert at everything. When they say Nuremberg trials or the military tribunals, they have a picture in their mind of something legitimate. Of course, in Stalin's Russia, they called it the show trials. We called it the show trials. We don't call the Nuremberg the show trials, but we can't tell the difference. What was the difference between Stalin's show trials and the show trials that occurred in defeated Germany 1945, 1948, 1949, when they were just sending them off to the gallows, and because it was more efficient, they were hanging men and women who had done no more than serve their country. They were hanging them in batches of 12 just to speed the process up.
Well,
Now, how much is it barbarism?
honestly, being hanged I think, is better than being left out in a field to die of exposure and starvation.
Absolutely. It's a horrible method of death, whatever they were, but even on the hanging, some of them were taking 12 to 20 minutes before their heart actually stopped beating. So it was not a quick death at all. As people say, well, it's all over like that, and it's not all over like that. The tests were conducted on the corpses once they had been dropped through the trapdoor, and it was taking a terrible long time. 12 minutes. We've been talking for 12 minutes. These guys were taking longer than that to die, and the ladies too. They even hanged a 13-year-old boy because he had a picture of Adolf Hitler, the legitimate Chancellor of Germany, on his bedroom wall, and they hanged a 13-year-old kid. This is barbarism. This is Soviet Union barbarism. This is insanity. And for them to posture as being the morally uprighteous is probably the most disgusting lie that has ever been told to the people. But how can we know?
Oh, I exactly. And Ursula, what's Ursula's last name? I'm drawing a blank here.
Who?
Ursula?
Ursula, I've just been looking at her on Facebook. Sorry, but you've missed me there.
Okay, sorry.
But, you're absolutely right.
But here she is. I mean, and they break into her home in the middle of the night, like brave men of a...
She's 87 years old, isn't she?
87 years old. And they're so brave. They have to go and terrorize her in the middle of the night.
Yeah, nobody's safe in Europe. There was I think he was a 15-year-old in Austria, and he has just been jailed for 5 years for displaying a picture of a swastika on Facebook.
Oh
now, that is
God.
pretty sick, Patricia. That is pretty sick. So this is the sort of society that we're living in now. It's a terror situation. In Germany, of course, there are probably several million who agree with Ursula and the others who have been jailed for questioning the Holocaust fraud. But, of course, what they do is they will take at random 1 or 2 or a dozen or 20 or 30 or more, and this will be a warning to the others.
Absolutely.
So when I was jailed for a very innocuous leaflet, this is not so much a slap on the wrist for me, it's a warning to others that if you publish leaflets condemning the coloured immigration invasion of Europe, then you are risking losing your job, being demonised by the press, and going up to the prison and being terrorised. So it's a form of terror.
Well, that's exactly what's going on here in the U.S. with the Bundy defendants. I call them the heroes. All these patriotic heroes that stood up to the federal just terrorism that they were trying to Waco a family here. And I don't know if you followed any of that, but one of the wives of one of the men were on the past hour. It's the 2-year anniversary right now. But then they've picked up all these. They put a 25-year-old that was up in Oregon for 2 weeks. They put him in prison, and they want to keep them there forever. Not so much because of what they did, but just as you're saying, to make an example of them so people will think 10 times before they go out and stand up to this terrorist Bolshevik government again.
Yeah, absolutely. They're being terrorized, and most people, again, in their innocence, you know, they want the quiet life. You can't blame them for that, so they just keep their head down. So, in actual fact, what is happening in the West now is exactly what they say, which was a lie, was happening in the Reich. And here, just as in Bolshevik Russia, they're telling you you can expect the dawn knock at the door if you question the government. Now, does anybody, it doesn't really matter whether they agree with me or you or not, whether they're Republican or whether they're Democrat, it really doesn't matter, Patricia. Do they really want to live in a state like that because it's run by Republicans or it's run by Democrats? We want freedom. We want the ability to talk. We can't have a radio station like yours. Your radio station, Patricia, we don't have them in Europe. We can't have them in Europe. You'd be picked up. You'd be arrested. Have you tried it?
Well, you know, Mike, it's getting to that, but you're hopeful about this.
Yeah, absolutely hopeful. And again, I identify Europe today with Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Eastern Bloc, Poland, Romania, the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia as it was at the time. And these illegitimate rulers of the Soviet Bloc states, there were 16 of them, they must have thought how powerful they were, that they were the untouchables, and that the Soviet Union would last 1,000 years. And I recall David Irving, my fellow historian, saying that in 1 year's time the Soviet bloc will collapse, and of course they laughed at him. Now, about 1989 it all started crumbling, and perhaps even if you had a controlled press, they can't hide everything. You saw the walls coming down in Europe. You saw the frontiers coming down. You saw people going through them into Western Europe. And these governments were toppled one after another. Nikolai Ceausescu of Romania, he thought he was absolutely safe in December that year, which escapes my memory. And but before Christmas, he and his disgusting family were placed up against the wall, and they were gunned down. The others were fortunate, but at least they were thrown out of government, and that is what is going to happen here in Europe. We've got a massive swing. I hate using the term right, nationalism, or racial nationalism, protectiveness. And we're doing for once, for the first time in our lives, Patricia, we're doing what the Jews are doing. We're putting our own people first. And if we're going to do that, if we're going to escape the malevolent influence of Washington, D.C., that's got to go first, and then these governments will be toppled, and it will happen very soon. We're talking months.
Oh, I loved it, you know, because all we get is bad news about this, Mike, so I'm so encouraged to hear you say this. But, you know, Mike, I don't know if... Are Europeans, ethnic Europeans, are they as brainwashed as Americans have become? Because the Jewish media, and I include the academia as well, has tried to convince white people that there's only one race, the human race.
Yeah, we're much more sophisticated and more aware. And I come back to something that you know and I know, is beware of the media over there, because they are making the news. They're not reporting the news. So they are giving a completely false impression from the reality. And people are not thinking that way at all. Now, the Daily Mail, I don't like it. It's a horrible newspaper, but it's the biggest online newspaper in the world, and the numbers who read it are phenomenal. Now, if you go onto there and the stories that are relevant to the sort of things that you and I are talking about, it is very refreshing to go down the readers' letters to see what they have got to say. And it quite amuses me that a lot of people go onto the Daily Mail not to read the news story about, the coloured invasion of Europe, but to read the readers' comments.
Oh, I think that I love reading comments most of the time because they're so insightful. There's some smart people out there.
Oh, absolutely. And, I don't know how much longer the press can go along with it, because what we're finding is that the reporter who actually writes up the actual story, he is being ridiculed right throughout the readers' letters for his spin, for not telling the whole story, for his bad writing and all the rest of it. But right across Europe, Patricia, America, we're going to get the Front National in France, Marine Le Pen. She is likely to be the next president of of France, and she makes Donald Trump look like a liberal.
Well, he really is. But from your mouth to God's ear, I would love to see Front National in charge in France. Wouldn't that be amazing? And what do you see happening to Merkel? Are Germans just disgusted yet?
They are indeed, and again, they're twisting the truth. They're saying that 45% support her immigration policies. Well, anybody who believes that, will believe in the fairies at the bottom of the garden. She is not only hated in Germany, she is probably the most hated person in Europe. Everybody despises her. There is no way that she or any other Western leader could go for a stroll in the streets as Adolf Hitler did. None of them could, because I don't think that they would walk 50 meters without being stoned to death.
Oh my gosh! Even at the end of the war, Hitler would travel in an open car, and the Germans loved him for what he did for them.
Yeah, there is a resurgence right throughout Europe. The National Democratic Party, they actually march through Germany in large numbers, holding National Socialist banners. It's the same in Greece with the Golden Dawn Party. It's the same with Finland and the Populist Party, the Danish People's Party, the Party for Freedom in the Netherlands, Hungary, the Jobbik Party. Viktor Orban, who is the Prime Minister of Hungary, he is on everybody's wish list to be the Putin of Western Europe and to save us from this disgusting plutocracy that we've been burdened with. But even in Hungary, they've also got the Jobbik Party. And believe me, they make the stormtroopers look like a bunch of pansies. These guys are pretty clued up.
I'm so encouraged to hear all this, Michael. And,
absolutely. Right throughout Europe, the Freedom Party in Austria, they are big, these are powerful, and these people are going to overthrow. It's people power. You're not going to vote these people out. You're going to throw them out by the fist. This is unfortunate, but Turkeys don't vote for Christmas. It was the politicians who created the system. They didn't create it so that we could vote them out, so there's going to be other means to vote them or get them out.
Well, great, but here's my problem. Explain to me. I've seen nationalist parties come and go here, and they do well for a while. But there's so much infighting. We don't need enemies. We don't even need Jews attacking us. From what I can see, white people have such huge egos, they can't get along with one another. They refuse to put their differences aside and focus on, as you say, cohesion.
Yeah, we're still tribal, aren't we? We don't live in different tribes or clans. What we do is we live in our different classes and our different cities. And you support one football club, I support another. And you support one political party and I support another. But basically, we're still in clans. And it's a little bit of a time that we put ourselves first. And the greatest dream I have is already half completed. We have a beautiful diaspora of ethnic Europeans right throughout the world, North and South Hemisphere, and almost crowning the earth. We are 1 billion. The Jews are 14.5 million. I'm not a mathematician, but I would say that for every Gentile, Christian Gentile on earth, there's probably, for every 100, there's probably only one Jew. So how come that they're pulling the strings? We are powerful, we ethnic Europeans, if we can become united. So forget this guy who's supporting the Democratic, or he's a religious, he belongs to the Lutheran Church or the Catholic Church. Forget all of that division and just put the colour of your skin. It was George Lincoln Rockwell, your fantastic leader, who said in the next war, the colour of the skin will be the uniform. And this is what's happening. And if we don't start sticking together, I'm going to rescue a woman. I'm not going to ask her if she's voting a Republican or Democrat. If she's my color of the skin, I'm going to rescue her. And this is the sort of situation that we find ourselves approaching now.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that. And maybe you can encourage me on this as well, because, I see Democrat and Republican. I mean, they're just two different factions of the same Communist Party.
Yep.
There's not a nickel's difference between them. One's taking us to hell at 97 miles an hour and the other at 95. I mean, it's insane. So here's the thing, though. But the Jews, for instance, here in the U.S., they're only 2% of the population, yet they control 45% of the judiciary.
Yeah, they're as powerful in the United States as they were in Bolshevik-occupied Russia.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But here's the thing: they couldn't do it without us useful idiots. Look at all the men that have been arresting the Bundys and their guards and their, just horrible.
This is Shabbos Goy. I hate them much more than...
When you were arrested by ethnic Europeans.
Yeah, that's right. It's a Shabbos Goy. A Jew is only doing... We can't really blame the Jew because the Jew is doing for his people what we want our own people to do for us. He's putting his own people first. But anybody who works for the Jews and carries out their work, I certainly got a different penalty. I certainly got a different judicial system, a different future for those. Because when I was prosecuted, when the police came to me because I had published a pamphlet in which I had reproduced Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, which in my mother's time was in every school book anyway, those policemen who came to serve me with the papers to arrest me were white Gentiles. They were not Jews. When I went to court, the people sitting on the jury, for the large part, there was 2 or 3 Asians, but for the large part, they were white Christians. The prosecuting counsel that denounced me was not Jewish, as far as I could see, and nor was the judge. I was sentenced on 4 counts of 4 months jail for publishing leaflets critical of the government's immigration policy. The police truck that came for me, that was driven by, of course, a white man, and I was put into jail. That was almost, I don't think, in that Victorian jail in Liverpool, I don't think there was a single Jewish prison warder. They were all white, and they were the ones who terrorized me to make sure that I didn't contaminate with my political views the other inmates. So that entire system was Gentile, and these people on one day, they're going to pay. They're going to be outed, they're going to be exposed, and I have said this before, that without exception, if you have worn the uniform of the undemocratic states here in the European Union, then you are going to be depoliticized before you carry on your work. We're going to do the same to you as you did to the Germans in 1945. You called it denazification. Well, we're going to call it de-uniforming you. And we're going to get your mind back on track before you're ever allowed to work for a government department again.
It's interesting. My friend Blackbird9 pointed out a great quote. He said that Lenin said that governments come and go, but the police stay the same.
Well, that was a pretty darn good quote, and he said quite a few that we can't argue with. He said that 3/4 of mankind may perish so that the survivors experience communism. And it was Lenin who said that if only, if only a handful of people in St. Petersburg in 1917 had known what we were about to do, we could have been stopped. Now, what does that tell you, Patricia? What does it tell the American people? That it just takes a handful of us to say this far and no further. And it's happening in Washington, D.C. now, where you've had over 600 arrests in the last few days. That sort of thing only happens in a country that has entirely lost its roots in democracy. So you are living in a police state now when 600 ordinary people like you and me go to demonstrate at the country's capital, in your case, Washington, D.C., and they are arrested. You're in deep trouble. You're on the abyss.
Oh, absolutely. So, but Mike, let me ask you, 1979 is when you were arrested for Rudyard Kipling. Rudyard Kipling.
Rudyard Kipling, yeah, he was the Queen's poet, and of course he's much loved, and he was much loved then, and earlier generations. People don't read so much poetry now, but his poem, If, was framed and up on the wall of every British home. And another of his, he composed about 700 altogether, but another of his was The White Man's Burden, of carrying the people who are not white.
And when the Saxon learns to hate, wasn't that it? When the Saxon awakens?
That was another one of his. I have published that, republished it, of course, since, and I publish a lot of ethnic European poetry myself. But yeah, that poetry, that poem, The White Man's Burden, was very, very popular but you see, what they did is they didn't actually prosecute me for publishing the poem. Otherwise, every school teacher might easily have risked arrest. Now, what they did is, in circumstances that were likely to cause racial hatred. So this was why I was arrested, for publishing that poem in circumstances that could likely lead to racial unrest. And that's what I got 4 months for.
Oh my God! But did Rudyard Kipling's prophecy, if you will, come to pass? Look at England today. It's a hollow shell of itself.
Yes, and George Orwell was absolutely right as well. We do live in a very Orwellian society, and it's a desperate situation, but it's not as desperate as the media would like to point out. The media, the Jewish-owned media, they believe in the Napoleonic adage. Is the first thing you must do is convince your enemy that they cannot win, and this is what's happening with the media now in Western Europe and in the United States, of course, is they are convincing you, they are trying to convince you Americans that you have accepted racial amalgamation, and they exaggerate the numbers of liberals who are pro-immigration. But this is simply not a reflection of what is actually happening. And I used to think that I didn't experience it, thank goodness, but I used to say that it happened to me in some respects, actually, in Britain. If you're in a social occasion, we all think the same, Patricia. We don't like we don't like race mixing and all the rest of it. We're both, if we can talk in private, we both agree on many things, but you don't bring it up at the dinner table, do you? And that's what's happening in the United States now. They don't like what's happening, but they keep their mouths shut because they're intimidated. And this is the way it must have been in the Soviet Union. You didn't like what Stalin was doing, but you kept your mouth shut because you didn't want to get the knock at the door either. That's what's happening in America now.
Well, Russians received the German soldiers with delight and embrace, and just was so delighted when they came to liberate them from Stalin.
Yeah, and thanks to the internet, we're seeing these pictures. You wouldn't see these pictures. I published on Renegade not so long ago exactly this subject, the liberation of Ukraine and Belarus and Russia itself, of course, by the invading German forces. And they were treated as liberators. Now, they can...
Pardon me, go ahead.
Yeah, they can control the press, but they can't control an awful lot of things. Now, the German armed forces were in Ukraine for nearly 3 years, and during that period, like the Americans in Vietnam, perhaps more so, is they created relationships. They wrote poems, they wrote letters, they drew pictures, they took photographs of themselves at cultural events with the Ukrainians. They took pictures of the Ukrainians welcoming them. They can't hide those thanks to the internet. You won't go down your high street and walk into a bookshop and see many of these pictures. If you do, the captions have all been distorted. The Russians are just as guilty.
Photoshop some of them to make
them
terrible. They even Photoshop some of them to make them look like they were committing atrocities. When you see the real photograph, it's amazing. Well, we're grateful for our friend Tom Goodridge for Hellstorm and what Kyle was able to do with that into a documentary. Of course, Dennis Wise has been leading the charge, and so many men like Mike King. I mean, the word's getting out. And because I think this World War II situation is one of the linchpin events. It's like 9/11. When people know the truth of really what happened in both those events, the Jews are just demolished.
Yeah, all of these people that you just mentioned, they're absolutely fine people, and there is no infighting at all. You know, we all support each other. I talk on quite a few broadcasting systems, as you know, and they all like Renegade. Renegade likes them. We like the people in Australia. We love the people in Europe, and we love the people in South Africa. So we are really getting on fine. So again, you will get these small parties and their rivals, and of course, a political party doesn't want to lose its members to another. But let's face it, in 1920s Germany, I think there were 400 political parties, and they were all fighting each other instead of the system, which is what the system wants. But of course, one party came to the fore. It was the National Socialist German Workers' Party. It was led by Adolf Hitler, but of course he led a team, and that team was particularly good at doing what they did, and the rest is history. In January 1933, Europe got its first overwhelmingly, genuinely, democratically elected leader in Adolf Hitler.
Yeah, and so people think, oh, we just brainwashed the German people. Not true. But listen, folks, you're listening to Sacred Cow Barbecue on Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. We are listener and volunteer supported, so I want to encourage you to go over to Freedom Slips and make a small donation. If everybody that listened just made a small donation every month, we wouldn't make these silly announcements. And but hey, freedom's not free, and Freedom Slips isn't free. Help support the station if you would. But while I'm doing this commercial kind of thing, I mean, I know if you're listening, you're being impacted by what my guest Mike Walsh is saying tonight. So, Mike, tell us how people can get a copy of your book.
Well, the best way is it depends on what kind of what hat they're wearing. I'm a poet as well. I've got an international reputation as a poet. So if they're looking for the poetry, just the name is quite simple to remember, actually. You'll be ever so pleased. With respect to my Polish friends, you'll be ever so pleased that I'm not Polish. My name is Michael Walsh, okay? W-A-L-S-H. And you go on to Amazon and you look for heart-to-heart poetry. Now, interesting this, we said before that people are not, they love poetry. They absolutely adore it, but they don't buy it, so don't make any money out of it. This is the reality, you know, they're coffee table books. But if you want the truth, then please go on to Amazon, Amazon Books, Amazon Kindle, and click in Mike Walsh, not Michael, Mike Walsh, M-I-K-E, Walsh, W-A-L-S-H. And just look up one book, and that will give you access to all of the others that I've got my name on the front of. And that book is Witness to History. Just go on, Mike Walsh, Witness to History, and you've just opened the door to the lies that have been told about the Workers' Reich all of those times, and you will be totally amazed. You just turn over every page and you'll scratch your head, and you say, I just can't believe it. But it's not my opinion, folks. Nobody's interested in my opinion or anybody else's opinion. This is the truth, as it was said by the people who organized the terrible times through Europe in which 70 to 100 million people died, and this is the truth. It was not a Russian Revolution. It was a regime change that was organized by Wall Street, and exactly the same happened in Russia in 1917 as it tried to happen in Syria. It failed, thank goodness. In Libya and all the rest of it, it was a regime change in which the Jews were running one vast plantation right across Europe to the Bering Straits, where you overlook the Bering Straits to Alaska. That was one big plantation staffed by white Christians, run by Jews, the Gulag and all the rest of it. But it's all there, right the way through, all the truth that you've never been told. Thank you.
Well, that's great. I can't wait to get my hands on a copy, Mike, because this is a fascinating subject. And, you know, we're so brainwashed. I know myself, you know, I didn't wake up to the truth about Hitler's Germany, and it was by a South African man's website, Adolf the Great. It's been taken down. You have to get it in, what's it called? The Wayback Machine. And boy, what an education I started getting there. It was amazing, and then it's just gone on and on. But I'll tell you, it took years before I could see, like those, the Nuremberg rally photos. Of just masses of people in the Wehrmacht uniforms and whatnot, and not get kind of a revulsion. I mean, we are so programmed, even knowing better, it still kind of hit me a little bit. Now I can see those photos and have tremendous pride in what our folk have done.
Yeah, you remember I was born early on, and so in my period I was a contemporary of the Beatles in Liverpool, so that will give you a date in your minds. With the late 1950s, I was in New York as a seaman. I got to know New York better than I knew my own city of Liverpool. And these were the times when most of my older shipmates had served in the war, and many of them had been captured during the war. And, of course, that was the generation that had served in the war. And I can say now, and I'm putting my hand on my heart, Patricia, I have never, ever met a British serviceman who had a single bad word to say about the Germans. Many of them were captives of the Germans, and they said, I was glad I was captured because my mates got killed. But we were living in something that was better than Ponton's or Butman's holiday camp in England. And they all spoke very, very well of the Germans, and including one who had been captured twice. And he said, I was ashamed to be British. He said, we were treated so well by the Germans. And as I've said before, the Germans made the English say that Hitler made one mistake. He wasn't born an Englishman. But
well, I'll tell you, that is the exact same story that Yankees, Northerners say about being, captured by Confederate soldiers. And they were well treated, they were honored, they were treated as gentlemen. And what Southern soldiers went through at the hands of Northern, the Union armies is just despicable.
Yeah, if you were an American soldier that were captured by the Germans, your chances of survival were a downside higher than living as a civvy in Chicago or anywhere like that. That's the reality. The camps were very similar to what we had in England as holiday camps. They had the theatre, they had the library, they had the educational facilities. Life was pretty good, and a downside better. They actually had heating. Well, in the British Army camps in Britain today, many of the troops complain that they don't have any heating. But when they're sent out to fight in Britain's wars, then the Asians, or rather the non-Europeans, are brought into their barracks, and the heating is installed. So the British soldiers don't get any heating, but the illegal refugees do get the heating. You just work that one out and then say that we're not being betrayed. And we're being betrayed by those three people. The governing elite, we're being betrayed by the media, who is distorting the news, and we're being betrayed by the uniformed judicial department, who are protecting the government. And they should be ashamed of themselves.
Well, I think one of the squadrons, they're elderly gentlemen now, that were responsible for the firebombing of Hamburg and Dresden and the working class neighborhoods in Germany. They are no longer invited to any of the World War II ceremonies in Britain. They don't ever want to let that out because it was so against any convention of war to bomb working class neighborhoods the way they did.
Yeah, it was grossly illegal, and it was the British Prime Minister who pointed it out. It was Chamberlain who said that what we're doing was grossly internationally illegal. The Americans and the British, they were using phosphorus in their bombs, and this has always been illegal. That was like napalm. Mm-hmm. And there was no other reason for it, as Professor Lindemann said, is to instill terror in the German people. You just talk about Hamburg, and of course other people talk about Dresden. We forget there were so many other German cities. I listed them all. And there were, I think, 56 major cities. Now, we're talking about major cities like you got in the United States. And they were just reduced totally to rubble. And some of them had no influence on the war at all. They just didn't produce anything. And they were just totally turned into a parking lot for no other reason than the United States Air Force and the Royal Air Force could do it. And I say, 15 million Germans died after the war ended. The war ended on May 8, 1945. That was the worst terror. And the Germans used to say, we can survive another war, but we can't survive another liberation. And it's not sarcasm alone. 15 million Germans were starved to death or deported and never came back to Germany after the war ended. You just imagine those numbers, 15 million. Nobody ever hears about these poor people. It was Winston Churchill, I think.
Now, there's a whiskey-sodden bastard.
Yeah, he was, Eastern Germany, what was now, the northeastern side of Germany. There was a population of 4.5 million Germans. These are Germans like, our children, our mums and dads. These were ordinary Germans who'd never, ever raised a fist to anyone in anger. They were rural people, remember, in those days. It was all horse-driven. So when the Polish leader in exile said to Winston Churchill, what about the 4.5 million Germans? And do you know what Churchill said? Oh, don't worry about those. Stalin will see to those. And he did. None of them were left alive. 4.5 million killed on the roads just in that part of Germany. You never get that in your history school books.
No, and since you mentioned Poland, and let's talk about the Katyn Massacre for a moment, because I know I can just push the play button and you're going to be able to tell me all about that.
Yeah, this appeared in Smolensk, which was part of the Soviet Union at the time, and the figures have always been disputed, but I think that we can work on the assumption that there were round about 30,000 Polish officers. It was the intelligentsia. They were cutting off the head of not just Poland, mind you. It was Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia. All of the school teachers, all of the professors, the entire educational elite, the entire heads of the police forces and all of the administrative systems, they were all arrested, and of course the officers rather than the men, but the men were unfortunately roped in as well. And the idea behind it, Stalin, with Churchill's approval, was that if you could cut off the head of any nation's intelligentsia, then you only had the pliable peasants left, and they were much more easily controlled. This is what happened in Katyn. So these were not, for the large part, ordinary Polish troops that were done to death. They were the officers, they were generals, they were admirals. These were the leaders of Poland. They were the educational leaders. And we tend to talk about Katyn, as if it was a unique event. It was not a unique event. Hundreds of thousands were rounded up. I got friends right throughout the Baltic states. And the Baltic states, don't dismiss them because you're American or you're British and they're a little country far away. Latvia is regarded as the Canada of Europe. It's the size of Ireland. The population is the same. I have many friends there, and the Red Army came. One of my friends, and she was 8 years old. They had rounded up her family from its farm, put them onto rail cars, American-made, by the way, to send them to the Gulag, and the Red Army arrived at the school, called out her name, Dinah, called out her name, 8-year-old Dinah, and they dragged her outside and they sent her to the Gulag, which was about 6,000 miles away in winter. She was there for 5 years. She returned when she was 13 years old. Whoever hears about these? Every time I pick up the aforementioned Daily Mail or something about that, they're talking about a 19-year-old who was a German soldier, a guard at, say, Auschwitz or Belsen, all of those years ago, and they're charged a 19-year-old with killing 5 million Jews or something like that. Not once. Now, the Daily Mail, I defy you to pick up a copy of the Daily Mail without some bogus atrocity story about the Germans. And you'll be looking for a complete mystery.
Oh, yes, Hitler, you can't say anything that they don't have a comeback of, oh, my cat had kittens. Oh, don't you know that Hitler murdered, 1,000 kittens a day? I mean, you can't say anything that they don't come up with these fake atrocity stories. It's so annoying.
No, this is a little test that may amuse your readers, unless your listeners, unless they're Jewish. Is when you're at the next dinner party or a social gathering or something like that, saying, "Bring in the Second World War. Don't make it too political. You want to keep it a bit light-hearted." I just say, "I wonder how many Americans died during the war," and they haven't got a clue. If you ask them how many Canadians died, or British died, or French died, or German died, or even Russians died, they are totally clueless. And then say something like, how many Jews died? 6 million.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
I'm going to use it.
And then you ask, who's running the press?
Oh.
I think it's pretty obvious who's running the press. Everybody knows, and it's exactly the same in Britain, same in Germany. If I go into any social gathering in England, Scotland, And I say, oh, by the way, I wonder how many Britons died during the war. And they're clueless. They've got no idea and they don't care. But all of a sudden you say, how many Jews? 6 million.
Yeah, I have a friend that turns that around. He goes, whenever it brings up 6 million, he says, oh, I think it was 10 million. They go, really? He says, yeah, but they're still up a good 60 to 70 million. They go, well, what do you mean? Well, that's how many, white Russians were killed in the Bolshevik Revolution. So they're still ahead.
Oh, absolutely. It was Stalin. It's not my figures. I'm not plucking them out of the air. But during a conversation with Winston Churchill, who had incidentally organized the Bengal famine, in which tens of millions of Indians had died, just as a means of population control, and in a conversation with the dictator, Roosevelt's great friend, Joseph Stalin.
Uncle Joe. Uncle Joe.
Uncle Joe, yeah, Uncle Joe. A nice old figure, isn't he? And he said 10 million Ukrainians had died. Now, Ukraine is the biggest country in Europe, leaving aside Russia. The population then and now was about 44 million. And 1 in 4 had died through starvation. And that was deliberate to keep the population down. All of the wheat, everything was stolen. Everything that was needed to sustain these people was stolen. It was sold on the American market to repay the Wall Street bankers for financing the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, how is that for callousness? 10 million people, and that was in Ukraine alone. Larger numbers of Russians, and it is conservatively estimated that 70 to 100 million Christians were murdered by the Bolshevik Jews right throughout what we used to know as the Soviet Union. Where is that in the Jewish-owned media? None at all, not a single word.
Where's their Holocaust museum?
Yeah, there were even American citizens who just disappeared into the Gulag. When did they ever catch the news in the Washington Post or the Washington Times? Never, and they never will, because they don't matter, because they're not Jewish. If the name ended in Stein or Berg, perhaps they would have a chance of being talked about on CNN or Fox News. But because their name is Smith or Jones or something like that, they simply don't matter.
Well, that's true. And it's and like you said, killing off the intelligentsia. Well, the Jews have always said, kill the best goyim. And so, unfortunately, we're not left with the best and the brightest anymore of ethnic Europeans. And so we have to make do with what we have and get over ourselves. Mike, it has been a total pleasure to have you at Sacred Cow Barbecue tonight. I hope we can do this more often. I want to let everyone know again, your book is Witness to History. You can tell this resonates with you. Mike has done his homework and studied and really got the truth here. Please go to Amazon, do yourself a favor, get Witness to History. It's 4 volumes. You're set for the year. I mean, you're set for the year in really learning the truth about what's gone on that has brought us to this place in history where we're under this totalitarian regime. And we're still out waving flags and saying we're the land of the free and the home of the brave. No, we're the land of the fee and the home of the slave. So, Mike, you've got a minute to wrap this up, and then I'm going to let you go back to bed like I promised.
Yeah, because it's 6 a.m. in the morning here, but at least I'm in Spain and I'll be able to, well, I'm justified to go and have a siesta, aren't I? The weather is absolutely sublime here. So, I love the opportunity of talking with you and talking hopefully with so many American listeners and other listeners, because it's not national anymore, is it? You're just breaking down barriers with the sound waves. So it's a great pleasure and privilege to me, because I started off life and the best thing that I could do was go down Brick Lane, stand on a soapbox and talk to 20 or 30 people. I just couldn't have imagined doing what I'm doing with you and your listeners now. This is magic.
Well, Mike, I was on someone's show the other night in the chat room, and they said, oh, who's on your show this week? And I told them, and they said, oh, Mike Walsh, he's fabulous. So I had high hopes for, and I knew the other day after we talked what a great show it was going to be. So I hope people have learned a lot, and they'll continue to, be educated about this, because that's the thing. American patriots, they still use that, just thinks it's Nazi Germany. My guest earlier did. They don't understand. They've been miseducated in that. So it's just been fabulous. So what's your latest book about again?
It's going to be called the Reich Renaissance, and it's going to be broken up into those 4 places. 1 book, 4 places, and it's going to show life in Russia, United States, Britain, and Germany during the 1930s. And you get ready to be amazed.
Oh, sounds brilliant. Okay, everybody, Michael Walsh, Witness to History. Mike, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Patricia.